All right. Today I'm going to be talking with Zack Kruse. He's a scholar of comic books and culture, educator, occasional comic book writer, and podcaster and comic book convention, according to his Tumblr profile. So he recently wrote a book about Steve Ditko. So we're going to be talking about that. So let me just bring him in and let him introduce himself.
Hi, gang.
Hi.
How's it going? Oh, just great, man. Living the dream.
I just noticed the long box, the drawer boxes behind you.
Oh yeah, that's about I don't know, like a quarter of it. The other stuff, everything else is on the other side of the basement. So stacked away. This is the stuff that I just have to have like right at hand.
Well, all mine's in the storage unit, but so how did you get into comics? What was the first? Do you remember the first comic that you read, and what the one that got you hooked?
Well, it's hard to say which was the first comic that I read. I don't really know. My parents and grandparents were always buying them for me. So I had a lot though, and book and record sets with like the Super Friends and Spider-Man and all that kind of stuff. But the first one that I really remember that really grabbed me was Batman 402, which is written by Max Allan Collins, which, I mean, I didn't know that. I was 4 or 5. But anyway, but I remember it distinctly because on the cover of that issue, it's 2 men dressed as Batman fighting each other, and one of them strangling the other, and it just melted my toddler brain. I couldn't, I remember staring at that cover for hours, trying to decipher the secrets of like how a man, let alone a Batman, could strangle himself. Right? How can there be 2? What's happening? So that's the one that I remember most distinctly from the from being a wee one, but I've always had comics around and superhero stuff, and that's always just sort of been a part of like the fabric of my identity, I guess.
Okay, so I guess you took that and kind of made it into a field of study.
Yeah. Well, I mean, more or less. I guess I wanted to do, this is something I really wanted to do when I was like 14. I always wanted to be like a doctor, but do pop culture. And I didn't know that that was a thing you could do. It was a thing you could do. I just didn't know that. And even when I was getting my undergrad degree, I always tried to work comics into all of my coursework as much as I could. But even then, I still didn't really understand or grasp that this is a thing you can make happen. And at the time, early 2000s, you couldn't. But starting in the mid 2000s, around, and right around close to 2008-ish, it became a thing. Comic studies became a thing that people started to really sort of coalesce around. And by the time I went back to grad school in 2009, 2011. I don't know anything about time anymore.
Who does?
Yeah, I don't think any of us do. But by the time I went back in 2011, it was something that you could take serious, or you could be taken seriously for doing it or for being interested in it. So I took advantage of that, and have carved a career out of it.
So tell us a bit about the book that is. I assume this is your thesis for your Ph.D. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I had this project in mind when I went to Michigan State. I went there. I chose to go to Michigan State because I met with the guy, Gary Hoppenstand, who would become my dissertation advisor, and I told him what I wanted to do and what I was doing, and said, "Would you be willing to chair a project like this?" And he was very excited, enthusiastic about it. So it worked out. But basically, honestly, what it was is, yes, it's my dissertation, but really my dissertation is excerpted from the book, right? I was writing the book and then just took selections from the book and then turned that in as my diss.
Okay.
So the book is an extra, I don't know, 100 pages more, 150 pages more than the disc. But yeah, that was sort of the genesis of it. I always knew it was going to be that. And in fact, the first thing that I published that would eventually become a part of the book, I published that in 2014. So I've been working on this for quite some time.
And the book revolves around a little-known creator named Steve Ditko, correct?
Yeah, not a lot of kids know who this guy is.
Tell us what you know about him.
I know a lot. So the book is called Mysterious Travelers, and it is about the philosophy and politics of one Mr. Steve Ditko, who was the co-creator of Spider-Man, the sole creator of Doctor Strange, the creator of Hawk and Dove and the Creeper, Shade the Changing Man, Mr. A, The Question, Ted Cord, co-creator of Captain Atom, and on and on and on and on. And, since I was, in fourth or fifth grade, I've just been enamored with his work, and I've been thinking about it and talking to people about it for a really long time. So in my research and in my reading and in my communications with Steve by letter and then eventually in person, it became really clear to me that he is not the person that fans like to say he was. He was much more complicated than that. He gets a bad rap because he's often accused of being an objectivist. And maybe there's someone listening in on this who is a fan of Ayn Rand for reasons known only to themselves, but who wants Ditko to be an objectivist. And he certainly has fans like that. He does. But he's not an objectivist. He likes Rand. He was a fan, but he was never an objectivist and never claimed it. And in fact, I wouldn't say he wrote extensively, but he wrote pretty decisively about this, saying that, no, I'm not an objectivist. He is his own person. So I took it sort of as my mission to sort of figure out, like, well, okay, if his philosophy is distinct to himself, what is it? What is that philosophy? Or if I can't figure out what it is, can I at least sort of tease out what it's demonstrative of? Like, what's going on? How does Ditkos Voice sort of reflect something that's happening in the 20th century? So that's really what the book does. It reframes all of our conversations about Ditko. It asks the reader to radically revise their assumptions about him. But I think it does so convincingly and compellingly. And what ends up happening is Ditko's work ends up being reflective of something that I'm calling in the book mystic liberalism, which is a combination of liberal and neoliberal capitalism of the 20th century with this sort of mind power, new thought movement, also really prominent throughout the 20th century. That it starts, at the end of the 19th and then picks up steam and then becomes really powerful in the post-war period because of people like Dale Carnegie and Norman Vincent Peale and the power of positive thinking and how to win friends and influence people and all that stuff. So these two ideas, they get really sort of tangled up in a complicated way. And Ditko's work is reflective of that. That doesn't mean he believes in new thought or the power of positive thinking, but in a certain way, his explorations, his philosophy, is revealing about those ideas. So that's really what the book is asking us to think about and think through, and really the value of his work as we're trying to sort of come to grips with what happened to America and American political thought in the late 20th century, and then how, as David Byrne, puts it, my God, how did we get here? How did we get to 2020? And I think Ditko's work provides maybe not answers, but certainly really compelling insights.
So can you give examples of how he may have used in any of the stories that he wrote for the characters that he created? I mean,
sure, yeah, absolutely. It's a career-long project, right? I mean, and that's the other thing that the book points out is that the ideas that he is accused of, right, in the 1960s and 70s with Mr. A and the question, the objectivism stuff, he's messing with that. He's messing with those ideas. He's toying with them as early as 1953, maybe earlier in his personal life, but we're only looking at the comics. So, but when his career starts in 1953, he's already sort of working with these ideas and karma and interest space and all that kind of stuff. But to more specifically, in The Amazing Spider-Man, Peter Parker, those 38 issues plus the 2 annuals that Ditko worked on with Peter Parker. Oh, and Amazing Fantasy 15. So that's what, 41 stories. That is one complete novel, right? It is a chunk of a story. It's not written, even though Stan Lee comes in and has his sort of editorial mandates about, certain things. As Ditko is plotting that out, he has plotted that out as a novel with a clear ending for Peter Parker, right? He is on a psychological journey to become something other, right? The Peter Parker that we meet in Amazing Fantasy 15, the sort of squirrely, introverted nebbish, is not the Peter Parker that we get by Amazing Spider-Man 33 in the lifting sequence, right? That's a different character. So a lot of what Peter Parker goes through is this sort of internal psychological change, right? That's all sort of predicated on Ditko's notions of the creation of the self and how you do that. The way that you create a self is by plumbing the depths of your mind and your soul and your spirit, and doing battle with all of the negative things, all of the things that hold you back, all of the baggage, the raw emotions, the guilt, anything like that, right? In the world of Mr. A, I mean, these are sort of the opposing forces of good and evil, right? And it is up to you, the individual person, to choose one of those things, right? But it's not a literal physical like battle where you are choosing evil or you are choosing good. You are choosing, what inside, like what kind of person you want to be, right? Peter Parker makes those choices. Similarly, at the same time, Doctor Strange is doing something basically the same thing in a much more literal sense, right? Doctor Strange is constantly going into internal pocket dimensions and internal spaces where he does battle with the problems of the psyche and the mind. One of the most significant sort of moments, right, or battles that he has, right, is with Dormammu. Dormammu is the ultimate sort of anti-mind character, right? He is symbolically presented as a character who has no mind. His head is just a ball of flames. He has no discernible head, right? Which in Ditko, in sort of the Ditkovian sense, is an indicator, is a symbol for the fact that he has no mind, right? That he does not think, that he is not rational. He is wholly irrational. And Doctor Strange has to sort of contend with that, right? How do you contend with the irrational, the part of your brain that has a lust for power, right? That wants to control and dominate all of these things. How do you keep that in check? Doctor Strange never defeats Dormammu, right? Eternity does. Doctor Strange doesn't. Doctor Strange just keeps him in check. So what's happening there, right? Well, it's something about the psyche and the self, right? In the same way, in Doctor Strange, both Doctor Strange and Dormammu have to work together and fight hard to keep back the mindless ones, who are very literally and deliberately named, right? Because they are mindless lumps of flesh that is just a horde that is bound to sort of, again, collapse the internal space of the dark dimension, right? Of the mind, right? That Doctor Strange has to protect. Or sort of keep in place. Clea is a similar case, right? Clea in those stories ends up being an avatar for doubt that has to stay in the dark dimension, right? Because she's an important check on Doctor Strange and reminds him to sort of be careful about all of these things. So that's a lot of what Ditko's contending with. But those stories, those ideas, they stretch out into The Question and Mr. A, neither of whom I think are real characters, but they are symbols, rather. They're ideas that the other characters in those stories have to respond to. This happens in Static. This happens again in Shade the Changing Man. This happens again in Hawk and Dove. Hawk and Dove is a great example of this, right? It is two opposing worldviews, mental conditions, right? The Dove with his sort of pacifism and desire for peace Hawk with his anger and his brutishness, right? Ditko's not on Hawk's side. He's saying here are two different here are two sides of the same coin, right? How do they get together? Well, they only win when they work together to sort of not compromise, but to come to an understanding with one another, right? So their father, who's the judge in those stories, right, becomes really central to how you understand it. He is the down the line rational person. He doesn't approve of Hawk's methods. He's not crazy about Dove, but recognizes that they have to work together in some way to find the path to rationality, to selfhood, to a space. So Ditko's really invested in all of those things in a way that's really not at all like objectivism in any significant way. But so that's where things get complicated with him. Where things get more complicated is that those ideas that he's dealing with are so predicated on the notion of self-esteem that's becoming really popular with Ayn Rand, as well as the power of positive thinking as it's sort of shepherded by Norman Vincent Peale and many others, and how those things sort of get wrapped up into neoliberal capitalism of the late 20th century and the libertarian movement and the neoliberal sort of consortium of politicians, especially Ronald Reagan. Reagan is a big proponent of these very same ideas and quotes them in really conspicuous ways. Donald Trump too, later, was a great fan of Dale Carnegie and Norman Vincent Peale, and was apparently friends, or allowed himself to be associated with Reverend Peale, and is invested in those things too. Hijinks ensue, as it were, with both both of those men. So Ditko's wrapped up in all of this, and not just in a philosophic sense in his comics, but many of his comics where he's exploring these ideas appear in Reason magazine, which I assume lots of folks know Reason now from their website, but has been a libertarian political magazine that's been in print since the 1960s. That was an early place where Ditko was really starting to explore a lot of his political ideas. He was printing them in Reason, and then eventually in Wally Wood's Wit's End. Mm-hmm. And there's a kid running down the stairs.
It's okay.
Okay. Anyway, so that's it, right? There's a lot happening there, and Ditko's comics are really complicated in ways that are not common for superhero comics of the 60s and 70s.
So, did I hear you right that you said that you met Ditko? Because from what I heard, he was, when compared to Stan Lee, he was kind of a recluse.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Well, it's correct that I met him.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I did meet him. I met him in the summer of 2018. Mm-hmm. And I was on a research trip working on this book because there was a bunch of his stolen artwork was on display at the Society of Illustrators, which is a complicated problem. But while I was there, I knew where his office was because he and I had exchanged letters before. And, and when I worked at Discount Comic Book Service, I sold his books for him and Robin Snyder. So, he had a vague notion of who I was. But anyway, I was in New York, and I stopped by. I just showed up. And there was a part of me that thought, like, man, this is not a good idea. This is really rude. The man just wants to do his job. And here you are knocking on his door. But there was a really selfish part of me that thought that if I didn't do that now, I was never going to have the opportunity to do that again. So I did it. And he answered the door, and we had a very brief, very pleasant exchange. At first, he was not happy to see me. He didn't know who I was. I don't know why he answered the door, but whatever he was expecting, it was not me. but he was really kind to me and generous with his time. And yeah, it was a very pleasant experience. It was a good reminder that he's a human being. So anyway, so yeah, I did meet him. I'm not so sure about the recluse stuff. I think that just because someone doesn't want to talk to you personally, I don't know if that makes him a recluse, right?
No, I understand.
Yeah, which is not to give you a hard time about it, because I think everybody calls him a recluse. I just think that he had a real problem with fanboys and didn't want to be a part of the fan press. And
because he didn't do a lot of conventions or any conventions, correct?
He did one. He did the first convention. He was at that first hotel show in 1964. In fact, he even did the program for it.
Okay.
But did not. It just wasn't a setting that really worked for him. A big part of his deal with fans is that he doesn't appreciate when fans start telling the artist what they should have done or what they did wrong, or start making demands on plots or how certain characters should behave. He thinks that's not.
Comic fans don't do that.
Right, yeah. Clearly, Steve Ditko is crazy, right? I am a 38-year-old man who's been reading comics since the very early 80s, and I can't think of a single instance of when that's happened. So anyway, so you know, I don't think he was a recluse, right?
Yeah.
I just think that he protected himself in a way that in the way that he thought was right. You know, protected like his headspace, because if you, and there's a Facebook page dedicated to it now, the man spent his entire life writing letters to fans. You know?
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, he wrote hundreds, if not thousands, of letters to fans, and answered some of the dumbest questions. You know, but I think that there's a big difference between that and opening yourself up to sort of the kinds of demands that I think he saw creeping into the fan press in the late 60s and early 70s, because he did a lot of stuff for fanzines throughout the 60s, a lot. But you know, things started to change.
Yeah, those press people.
Yeah, exactly. Enemies.
So was it? Yeah, I'm the enemy.
That's what I've been telling people all the way up to this interview. I was like, Chad is not one of the
enemy.
Yeah, he's the enemy.
Anyway, that's why I tell everybody at conventions when I asked if I can interview them.
Yeah.
I know I'm the enemy.
Yeah. Just so you know, I'm absolutely going to use this to smear you later. Now.
Wow, that might give me a little more exposure. So please do.
Whatever.
So was there anything that you learned during writing the book about Ditko that you didn't know or kind of stood out to you?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing was I drank the Kool-Aid on the objectivist stuff too, right? I mean, I totally believe that whole cloth, and I believe the recluse stuff too. So I really changed my mind about that a lot. Like I did like a complete 180 on all of that, and had to come to grips with the fact that, well, I say come to grips. That makes it sound really dramatic, but I had to acknowledge not just that I was wrong, but that I had accepted sort of a prefabricated narrative about someone without actually having done my due diligence to make sure I had read everything, or to make sure that I had really thought about what he was saying or doing on a particular page. So I learned a lot in that way. I also learned a lot about sort of the ways in which, the really complicated ways in which comics were produced in the 60s. Ditko was a really prolific writer about what it was like working in the Marvel bullpen in the 60s. It probably wrote more. Kirby and Gil Kane have done more interviews, but Ditko wrote a lot about his time in the Marvel bullpen and what those working conditions were like.
So, in your opinion, what do you feel that his greatest story, greatest piece of creation is? Something. What for you? What is his most I don't know, powerful or had the most impact on you?
Sure. I mean, to me, my personal taste, the two most significant works for me as a fan are Doctor Strange, and then later Static. If you had asked me this, years ago, I would have given sort of the pat Spider-Man, Doctor Strange answer. But Static was one. The more that I read it, the more that I came to really appreciate it and love it for what it accomplished, and for how interesting it was as compared to a lot of other stuff that was coming out about the same time. So those are the two big ones for me: Static and Doctor Strange.
Okay, so kind of besides being a author, I guess we can call you an author now. You also do you're also part of a podcast, Pictures Within Pictures. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what do you guys talk about? What's the premise of the show, I guess?
Yeah. So Pictures Within Pictures is a show that I co-host with my buddies, Ben Teed and Will Pfeiffer. Will Pfeiffer, the comics writer who worked on Catwoman for many years, as well as a number of other titles. But that's where most people will know him. So it's just the three of us. We get together and talk about comics. It's not really much. The format isn't really a format. We try to do about an episode a month, but the episodes alternate between one that's sort of a book club, and we take turns picking books that we assign to one another, and we just sort of dissect them. And then the other episodes that they alternate with are just what we've been reading recently. So pretty standard comics podcast type stuff on the second one. But we try to do especially with the book of the month, we try to take our time to really sort of think through what the comics are doing, and why they matter. I mean, we're not doing like huge historical sort of deep dives. We're not doing that kind of contextualizing, even though I think that would be really useful. Our commitment level is really about just enjoying our time together, right? And doing the fan thing and the friend thing. So it comes out, we're getting ready to release our 50th episode this month. So but we've been doing it for a few years.
And we were talking about it before we started talking, that where you guys got the title for the podcast.
Yeah, we cribbed it. We stole it straight from Frederick Wortham, right? And the subtitle of the podcast is for children who know how to look, right? I mean, that's also straight out of Wortham and him talking about children's abilities to get the hidden messages of comics, right? Like, and then go do crimes as a result.
And when we were talking, I mentioned that I purchased the book and I tried reading it. I honestly did.
Yeah.
It's a lot better if you have like a bottle of brandy or something strong.
Yeah, it's a tough one, man. And like the thing about him is that we were talking about this too, but he wrote a fairly interesting book about fanzines about a decade later, maybe 2 decades later, that I think is it's at least interesting. But like outside of his comic stuff, like as a sociologist, he kind of did some important work to try to create a greater sense of equitability for African American and economically disadvantaged children in New York. So he's such a strange person, and the comic thing is just it's just a weird deal. If he hadn't done that, he'd be remembered very differently, right? Because he's this old Marxist, and he he's he's like a Frankfurt School Marxist, and tried to apply that to help kids, and then went bananas on American comics.
Yeah.
It's strange.
So you're also, I'm correct that you're part of the Comics Studies Society.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? I started when I was, preparing for the interview. I started to, read a little bit about that, but I figured that you would be able to kind of give me a better, rather than the regular, pitch.
Yeah. So the Comic Studies Society was founded fairly recently. I was a founding member, but I wasn't on the founding board or anything like that. But it was started by American comic book scholars, and well, I guess that's not true. It's an international organization of comic book scholars, and our mission is to forward the field and to make sure that we are asking sort of the probing, generative questions that any academic discipline and field is trying to perform, trying to do. I'm currently an at-large member on the executive board. We have an annual conference. We have a journal called Inks, which is published through Ohio State University Press, and we're always looking for finding the best scholarship in the field, and sort of moving things forward as much as we can.
And I also know that you were involved with the Appleseed Comic Con. Given your experience with that, how do you, and given the current craziness that we're all dealing with the pandemic, what do you see as the future for Comic Cons? Or because I mean,
sure,
most of the major ones have already been canceled or postponed. I mean, I think the only one that's still up in the air is New York City, and I'm almost positive, I would bet, I don't know, my son, that they're going to cancel it.
Yeah. No, there's not going to be a New York Comic Con, right? But yeah, I founded and ran Appleseed in Indiana for 6 years. And then when I came to Michigan State, I took over the academic planning for the Michigan State University Comics Forum. So, I've been doing that since. So I guess I've got over a decade of convention planning, about 11 years, I guess. And as far as like the future of it, I mean, I guess the answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that any assumption that we're gonna have another comic book convention for like a year is not a good assumption, because of the nature of those events, right?
It'll give Concrete a whole new meaning.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, and this, right? Like, I mean, we all worry about Concrete and getting the Blicket and all that kind of stuff. And I was at C2E2, which, for all intents and purposes, is probably the last Comic Con for at least until maybe San Diego next year, right?
I don't know.
I'm not an epidemiologist, so I can't make predictions about what's going to happen with the virus, but it doesn't look good, yo.
Well, I don't know if you saw, but I know it's a smaller con, but Tampa was given the green light to go ahead, but that's Florida, so
yeah, I don't want to be hasty or too judgmental about that decision, because I don't want to make assumptions about their motivation.
Right.
But I just feel like that's I wouldn't go.
Right. I think that, I mean, if I were a creator and I was scheduled to go, the only way you could get me to go is set up a laptop at my table and I would zoom in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's a tough choice, right? Because for a lot of I mean, a lot of people that we know who are creators, I mean, their money, they're not making, they're making independent books, and the way that they get their name out or the way that they make money is it shows. So I can understand the temptation to want to be a part of something like that, to try to pay your bills, to try to have sandwiches, but I don't know. But on the other hand, universities all over the country, I mean, California notwithstanding, are probably going to be in person in the fall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I as a university instructor, I have a choice to make,
Right.
So
no, I understand. My brother also teaches at WPI, so I know that he's been doing remote teaching.
Yeah. But the problem is I think this is, I don't want to get too much off on a tangent, but I think this relates to I guess your question about conventions and when they're going to be back, is that universities, students, they think that they're worried that enrollments are going to tank, right? As soon as they say they're going to be online, that enrollment's just going to just plummet, right? Because nobody wants a University of Phoenix degree. So that's a real thing, right? Where it's people are going to start making those decisions, and they're going to start making those decisions pretty quickly. So we'll see.
Well, and I know that you were also involved with DCPS.
Mm-hmm.
What was your reaction to what happened with Diamond back in, what was it, April?
Yeah. Yeah. So for people who don't know me, I worked at Discount Comic Book Service from 2004 until 2011 when I went back, until 2011. When I went back to graduate school, or to restart graduate school very early. And I was the marketing director there for years, and I did a lot of I basically operated, spearheaded an initiative with the company to make independent titles available to DCPS customers. So that is to say, titles that were not in the Diamond Previews catalog. And I also worked with a lot of small press publishers to sort of run promotions through DCPS to sort of boost sales. So anyway, I was pretty involved with that stuff. And when it comes to the when it comes to the situation with Diamond and DCBS and Midtown picking up some of the slack, I guess, as it were, becoming sort of much smaller scale distributors, I wasn't surprised at all. Mm-hmm. I was not in any way surprised by that. It was something that I think Cameron's been thinking about. That is to say, the store owner, Cameron Merkler, has been thinking about for a long time, and wanted to do for a long time. And I don't mean that in any kind of way. And I'm 100% certain that Cameron his motivation in doing that stuff. And I should be careful about speaking for him because he's his own person. And I wouldn't want to speak mm-hmm. for him, but I think very highly of him as a human being. His motivation for this stuff is always his passion for comics. It's always been that. And regardless of whatever criticism gets thrown, his way and Midtown's way during all of this, Cameron's doing what he is going to do what he does because he loves comics as much as anybody I know. And I think he saw an opportunity to, he probably saw an opportunity to sort of express that love in a way that he's wanted to express that love for as long as I've known him. And mm-hmm. I hope that, I wish him nothing but the best in this. I hope it works out. And I also don't think that, Diamond's going anywhere either. Yeah. I think people that are worried about that are just out of their minds. That's not going to change anything. And I don't think it's going to change anything with the relationships that Diamond and DCBS or Midtown have with one another. Right. I just don't think that's going to happen.
All right, let's kind of get off the less serious stuff.
I mean, the world's changing, right? And
yeah.
these things are bound to happen. So.
Yes. So, have you been since new comic books? Are you reading? Well, not new comic books, but were you reading anything before the new comic books stopped coming out, or was there anything that in your collection that you picked up, in this time that you felt to go back and reread? Or
yeah, I've been doing what I can. I've been trying to get caught up on things that I kind of just sort of let slip. So just because I was just reading it today I was getting caught up on Grant Morrison's Green Lantern, which has been okay. I like it. It's fun. Mm-hmm. It's kind of what I expected for a Grant Morrison Green Lantern book, which is good for me. It's what I wanted out of it. Mm-hmm. So I've been reading that, and then I've been trying to read. I've been trying to get back and sort of read through a bunch of older stuff that I just haven't really thought about in a long time. So I've been pulling a bunch of old horror comics and horror comics collections off my shelf. So I recently reread a whole bunch of Bob Powell horror stories. I just love Bob Powell. And what was the other one I was reading? I've been reading a bunch of Bernie Krigstein stuff too. Because I'm getting ready to teach my summer class on comics and American culture. And every year I teach Master Race. So I've been just sort of revisiting a lot of Krigstein stuff and thinking about, how I'm going to approach that conversation this time around. So a lot of that kind of stuff. I haven't really read too many other new comics because I try to keep caught up as much as I can, but I'm not really good at that. So yeah.
So all right. So where can people find your book if they're interested in checking it out?
Yeah, I hope folks do. You can pre-order Mysterious Travelers directly from the University of Mississippi Press website. Right now they've got it they've got a 30% off pre-order price on it. You can also get it from Amazon, but if you don't want to get it from Amazon for reasons that are likely very good, you can also go to IndieBound, which is sort of a consortium of independent bookstores, and you can still. So if you don't have a independent bookstore near you, you can still order from one online, and then it'll be available for pre-order through comic shops in November or December of this year. It should be in the December previews catalog. Is when you'll find it there. So lots of different ways to get it. And obviously it'll be available for order through any bookstore anywhere, but if you want to pre-order it, those are the ways to do it. One thing I would let folks know is that academic books tend to be pretty expensive on the hardcovers. And there's really no difference between what the contents in the hardcover and the paperback. So whenever I buy new academic books, I just get the paperback, and you're getting the same thing. So for whatever.
Is there a chromium trifold gate cover?
Only on the hardcover.
Only on the hard.
So, I mean, you don't have to get it. It's the same content on the inside, but you want the gatefold wrap around with the chromium and the emboss, you're gonna have to drop the extra, $60 or whatever. So, and if
the con circuit ever, when it starts up, will you be doing, like cons to promote the book? Or
yeah, as many as I'm able. It'll just depend on my academic schedule. I'll end up doing a lot of those conferences as well. But yeah, I'll be around with it. So certainly things in the Midwest, and then we'll see sort of where the spirit guides me for others. It's gonna mostly depend on what con season really looks like in 2021. Right. I'd love to go back to Heroes. I haven't been to Heroes in about 10 years, and I'm really just itching to go back to Heroes. Yeah. So that would be a great place to take it.
So where else can people find your podcast, or where else can they find your stuff?
Yeah, so you can. Most of my stuff is I haven't really updated my Tumblr page in ever. But if you go to Zack Kruse, ZACKKRUSE.net, that'll take you to my Tumblr page. One of these days, I'll tell you about what happened to the .com. So that'll take you to the Tumblr page, and most things are sort of linked through there. But
Okay.
So you can find me there. You can find me on Twitter at my name. Same with Facebook. And you can find pictures within pictures on Twitter at PWP Comics Pod, as well as at on Libsyn. And it's available in Pictures Within Pictures is available through all podcatching services. So if you're using Stitcher or Apple Podcasts or whatever, or if you're just running an RSS feed, it's available through all of those. And
I'll definitely include those in the description of for the video.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think I've kept you long enough. So I just want to say thanks for taking the time to talk, and stay safe and stay healthy.
I will. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All righty. Have a good evening.
You too, buddy.
All right.